In the grand halls of Avaloria's ancient palace, where portraits of kings and queens have watched over centuries of secrets, a single discovery threatens to topple a thousand-year-old monarchy. When Queen Isabella finds a hidden chamber behind her late mother-in-law's portrait, she uncovers more than dusty relics. She discovers evidence of the greatest theft in royal history. Ancient jewels worth millions, sacred artifacts that legitimize the crown's power, and documents that could rewrite the kingdom's entire bloodline have been secretly hoarded for decades. But as Isabella confronts her husband King Alexander with the shocking truth, she realizes the theft wasn't committed by outsiders. The betrayal came from within the royal family itself, and now she must choose between protecting the crown she's sworn to serve and exposing the lies that built their entire reign. In a kingdom where loyalty is everything and secrets are currency, Queen Isabella is about to learn that some truths are worth more than crowns, and far more dangerous than she ever imagined. Queen Isabella Montclair stood before the towering portrait of her late mother-in-law, Queen Victoria Avalon, feeling the familiar weight of expectation that seemed to emanate from those painted eyes. The morning sun streamed through the stained glass windows of the royal gallery, casting colorful shadows across the marble floor where Isabella's heels clicked with each nervous step. She had been avoiding this particular corridor for months, but today duty called her here. The annual inventory of the royal collection required her personal oversight. The portrait dominated the eastern wall of the palace's most prestigious gallery, depicting Queen Victoria in her ceremonial robes, wearing the crown of Avaloria with its distinctive sapphires that had been mined from the kingdom's own mountains 3 centuries ago. Isabella had always felt intimidated by the woman who had ruled Avaloria for 47 years before passing the crown to her son, Alexander. Victoria had been beloved by the people, feared by her enemies, and, according to whispered palace gossip, utterly ruthless when it came to protecting royal interests. "Your Majesty, the inventory team is ready to begin in the treasury," announced Lady Margaret Thornfield, Isabella's chief lady-in-waiting, as she approached with a leather-bound ledger tucked under her arm. Margaret had served the royal family for over 2 decades, first under Queen Victoria and now under Isabella, making her one of the most trusted members of the palace staff. Isabella nodded absently, her attention still captured by something she had never noticed before about the portrait. "Margaret, have you ever observed how this painting seems off somehow? The proportions of the wall behind Queen Victoria don't quite match the actual architecture of this room." Margaret stepped closer, adjusting her wire-rimmed spectacles as she studied the massive painting. "Now that you mention it, Your Majesty, there does seem to be a discrepancy. Perhaps it was painted from memory rather than life, or maybe some artistic liberty was taken for compositional purposes." But Isabella's instincts, honed by years of managing palace affairs and dealing with diplomatic intricacies, told her there was something more deliberate about the inconsistency. She had developed a keen eye for detail during her 12 years as queen, and something about the way the shadows fell in the painting versus the actual room nagged at her consciousness. "Has this portrait ever been moved or restored?" Isabella asked, walking closer to examine the ornate golden frame that stretched nearly from floor to ceiling. "Not to my knowledge, Your Majesty. It was commissioned immediately after Queen Victoria's coronation and has hung in this exact spot for 38 years. The only maintenance has been periodic cleaning by our art restoration team." Isabella reached up to touch the frame, running her fingers along its elaborate carved edges. The frame was substantial, clearly designed to support significant weight, but as she pressed against the right side, she felt something unexpected, a slight give, as if the frame wasn't completely flush against the wall. "Margaret, please ask the guards to ensure this corridor remains private for the next hour. I want to examine this more closely." Lady Margaret's eyebrows rose slightly, but she had learned long ago not to question the Queen's instincts. "Of course, Your Majesty. Shall I postpone the treasury inventory?" "Not postpone, delay it by 1 hour. And please bring Master Edmund from the maintenance staff. I need someone who understands the palace's original construction." As Margaret hurried away to fulfill these requests, Isabella continued her examination of the portrait. She noticed that the bottom right corner of the frame bore small scratches that weren't consistent with normal wear. They looked more like the marks left by tools, deliberate, purposeful scratches that suggested the frame had been moved or adjusted multiple times over the years. Master Edmund arrived within minutes, his weathered hands still dusted with mortar from whatever project he had been working on in the palace's ongoing restoration efforts. He was a man in his 60s who had inherited his position from his father and grandfather before him, making him an expert on every secret passage, hidden room, and architectural peculiarity the palace contained. "Your Majesty wished to see me?" he said with a respectful bow. "Edmund, I need to know about the wall behind this portrait. The painting suggests there might be architectural elements that aren't visible in the current room configuration." Edmund studied the wall with the practiced eye of someone who had spent his entire life maintaining the ancient structure. He tapped various points along the wall, listening to the subtle differences in sound that revealed hollow spaces versus solid masonry. "Interesting, Your Majesty. This section here." He tapped an area directly behind where the portrait's painted wall showed an archway. "Sounds distinctly hollow. Based on the palace's original blueprints, which I studied extensively during the West Wing restoration, there should be a small chamber behind this wall. It was likely sealed during renovations in Queen Victoria's early reign." Isabella felt her pulse quicken. Sealed? For what purpose? The historical records are incomplete, but many royal residences have hidden chambers for storing sensitive documents or valuable items during times of political uncertainty. It was quite common in the medieval period and apparently continued into more recent centuries as a precautionary measure. "Is there a way to access this chamber without damaging the portrait or the wall?" Edmund examined the frame more closely, his experienced hands finding what Isabella's instincts had detected earlier. "The frame appears to be mounted on a pivoting mechanism, Your Majesty. Quite ingenious, actually. If I'm correct, the entire portrait should swing away from the wall like a door, revealing whatever lies behind." The implication sent a thrill of anticipation through Isabella. "Show me." Edmund located a small, nearly invisible lever hidden behind decorative molding at the base of the frame. With a gentle pressure, they heard the distinct click of a mechanism engaging, and suddenly, the massive portrait began to swing slowly away from the wall, revealing a narrow doorway that led into darkness. Isabella stepped forward, peering into the hidden chamber. The space was small, perhaps 10 feet square, but even in the dim light filtering in from the gallery, she could see shapes, objects that had been carefully arranged on wooden shelves and tables. "Margaret, please bring several lanterns immediately," Isabella called. When the chamber was properly illuminated, Isabella gasped at what the light revealed. The small room was filled with items that clearly belonged to the royal collection: jewelry, ceremonial objects, documents and royal seals, and artifacts that she recognized from historical inventories, but had never seen in person. At the center of the chamber sat an ornate wooden chest that appeared to contain the most significant items. Isabella approached it carefully, noting that it bore Queen Victoria's personal seal, a distinctive rose and crown emblem that had been unique to her reign. The chest contained items that made Isabella's breath catch in her throat. There were pieces from the crown jewels that had supposedly been lost during various political upheavals over the past century. Ancient treaties bearing the signatures of long-dead kings were rolled carefully in protective tubes. Most shocking of all, there were detailed records, written in Queen Victoria's own hand, documenting the systematic removal of these items from the official royal treasury. As Isabella read through the documents, a disturbing picture began to emerge. Queen Victoria had apparently been secretly moving valuable and politically sensitive items into this hidden chamber for decades, but the records suggested this wasn't simple protective storage. The documents detailed specific items that had been reported as lost or stolen, when in reality they had been deliberately hidden away. One document in particular caught Isabella's attention, a letter addressed to "my dearest successor," and dated just months before Queen Victoria's death. The letter outlined what she called protective measures taken to ensure certain royal artifacts wouldn't fall into the wrong hands during turbulent times. But, as Isabella read further, it became clear that some of these protective measures had involved deliberately misleading the royal treasury, the parliament, and even other members of the royal family about the location and status of invaluable national treasures. "Your Majesty, is everything all right?" Lady Margaret asked from the doorway, clearly concerned by the expression on Isabella's face. Isabella looked up from the documents, her mind racing with the implications of what she had discovered. "Margaret, I need you to ensure absolute discretion about this discovery. No one else is to know about this chamber or its contents until I can fully understand what we're dealing with." "Of course, Your Majesty. But, may I ask, what exactly have you found?" Isabella gestured to the chamber around them. "Evidence that Queen Victoria may have been involved in what amounts to the largest theft in our kingdom's history. And the worst part is, I'm not yet sure whether she was protecting these treasures from external threats or hiding them from her own family and government. As Isabella carefully closed the chest and prepared to leave the chamber, she realized that her discovery had just complicated her life in ways she could never have anticipated. The woman whose portrait had watched over the palace for decades, the beloved queen who had been held up as the standard by which all future monarchs should be measured, might have spent her final years systematically looting the very institution she was sworn to protect. But the most troubling question of all was whether King Alexander, Victoria's son and Isabella's husband, knew about his mother's secret activities. And if he did know, how many other secrets might he be hiding from his own wife and queen? The hidden chamber stood silent once again as Isabella swung the portrait back into place, but she knew that her discovery would echo through the palace halls for years to come. The crown of Avaloria had been built on a foundation of trust, honor, and transparency with its people. Now Isabella faced the terrifying possibility that those foundations might be nothing more than carefully constructed lies. As she walked back toward the main palace, Isabella's footsteps seemed to echo louder than usual on the marble floors. Every portrait she passed, every royal symbol etched into the walls, every reminder of centuries of royal heritage now seemed to carry questions rather than certainties. She had always known that royal life involved secrets, but she had never imagined that the greatest secrets might be hidden within the royal family itself. The afternoon sun was beginning to set as Isabella finally made her way to the royal apartments, where she knew Alexander would be reviewing diplomatic correspondence in his study. As she approached the familiar oak doors, she realized she was about to have the most difficult conversation of her 12-year marriage. How do you tell your husband that his beloved mother might have been a thief? How do you accuse a dead queen of betraying her own crown? But, more importantly, how do you look into the eyes of the man you love and ask him if he knew about his mother's crimes all along? Isabella paused with her hand on the door handle, taking one final deep breath before entering what she suspected would be the beginning of the end of everything she thought she knew about her royal life. The weight of the crown had always been significant, but now it felt crushing, not because of its physical presence, but because of the moral burden of truth she now carried. Behind that door waited her husband, her king, and potentially her greatest adversary in the fight to restore honor to a throne that might have been built on decades of carefully hidden lies. Isabella entered Alexander's study to find him exactly as she had expected, seated behind his mahogany desk, surrounded by diplomatic papers and trade agreements that required his attention. The late afternoon light filtered through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the rich burgundy carpet that had been woven specifically for this room during his grandfather's reign. Alexander looked up as she entered, his weathered face breaking into the warm smile that had first captured her heart 18 years ago. "My dear, you look troubled. How did the collection inventory proceed?" Alexander set down his fountain pen and leaned back in his leather chair, giving Isabella his full attention. Even after 12 years of marriage, he still had the ability to make her feel like the most important person in the world when he focused on her this way. Isabella moved toward the window, buying herself time to choose her words carefully. Outside, the palace gardens were beginning their transition into autumn colors, with the ancient oak trees that had witnessed centuries of royal dramas now dressed in shades of gold and crimson. "Alexander, I need to discuss something with you that may be difficult to hear." The king's expression shifted subtly, his diplomatic training allowing him to mask concern behind polite attention. "Of course. Please, sit down and tell me what's troubling you." Instead of taking the chair he indicated, Isabella remained standing, her hands clasped tightly behind her back. "I discovered something today in the royal gallery, something that your mother concealed for decades." At the mention of Queen Victoria, Alexander's posture straightened almost imperceptibly. "What sort of discovery?" Isabella turned to face him directly, searching his blue eyes for any hint of prior knowledge about what she was about to reveal. "There's a hidden chamber behind her portrait, Alexander. It's filled with items from the royal collection that were supposedly lost or stolen over the past 40 years. Items that your mother deliberately removed from the official treasury and hid away." The silence that followed her words seemed to stretch endlessly. Alexander's face remained carefully composed, but Isabella noticed the slight tightening around his eyes that indicated he was processing something significant. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured and cautious. "That's quite a serious allegation, Isabella. Are you certain about what you found?" "I have her personal records, written in her own hand, documenting the removal of these items. Alexander, some of the pieces in that chamber include artifacts that we've told Parliament, and the people were lost during political unrest. The Meridian sapphires, the Treaty of Foundational Borders, even the original crown of queens that was supposedly stolen during the uprising of 1987. Alexander stood slowly, moving to the window where Isabella had been standing moments before. His hands were clasped behind his back in a gesture she recognized as his way of maintaining control during stressful situations. Isabella, you must understand that my mother lived through some of the most politically turbulent times in our kingdom's history. If she took certain protective measures, it was undoubtedly to preserve these treasures for future generations. The careful way he phrased his response sent a chill through Isabella. Alexander, did you know about this? He turned to face her, and, for the first time in their marriage, Isabella saw something in his eyes that looked like calculation rather than honesty. Isabella, there are aspects of royal responsibility that sometimes require difficult decisions. Decisions that may not always appear straightforward to those who weren't present when they were made. That's not an answer to my question. Isabella's voice carried a firmness that surprised even her. I need to know if you were aware that your mother was systematically removing items from the royal collection while reporting them as lost or stolen. Alexander moved back to his desk, ostensibly to organize some papers, but Isabella recognized it as a stalling tactic. My mother shared certain confidences with me before her death, yes. But those confidences were shared in the context of ensuring the security and continuity of the crown during uncertain times. Isabella felt as if the ground beneath her feet had shifted fundamentally. So you did know? You've known all along that these items weren't actually lost, while we've been telling our people and Parliament that they were gone forever. Isabella, you're oversimplifying a complex situation, am I? She moved closer to his desk, her voice rising slightly despite her efforts to maintain composure. Because from where I stand, it looks like your mother committed what amounts to theft from her own kingdom, and you've been complicit in covering it up for years. Alexander's diplomatic mask finally slipped, revealing a flash of the frustration he had been carefully concealing. Theft. Isabella, these items belong to the royal family. My mother was protecting them from political forces that would have used them as bargaining chips or symbols of rebellion. She was preserving them for the crown. By lying about their disappearance, by allowing our people to believe that our heritage was being stolen by criminals when it was actually being hoarded by their own queen. Isabella's hands were trembling slightly, but her voice remained steady. Alexander, do you understand what this means? We've built our entire relationship with Parliament and the people on transparency and trust. How can we continue to rule when our throne is built on decades of deception? Alexander sat down heavily in his chair, suddenly, looking older than his 54 years. Isabella, you don't understand the pressures my mother faced. The Republican movement was gaining strength throughout her reign. There were constant threats of revolution, of forced abdication. She was protecting these treasures from being seized and used as symbols against the monarchy. And what about the threats we face now? What about the Republican movement that still exists today? How do you think they'll respond when they discover that the royal family has been lying to them for decades about the security of our national treasures? The question hung in the air between them like a challenge. Isabella could see Alexander's mind working, calculating political ramifications and potential damage control strategies. But what she couldn't see was any sign of the moral outrage she had expected him to share upon learning about his mother's deception. Isabella, I need you to understand that revealing this information would be catastrophic for the monarchy. The Republican senators would use it as ammunition to argue for our complete abolition. We would be handing them the exact evidence they need to convince the people that the royal family cannot be trusted. Isabella stared at her husband in disbelief. So your solution is to continue the deception? To keep lying to our people about what happened to their national heritage? My solution is to protect the institution we've both sworn to serve. Isabella, these items can be quietly returned to the official collection over time. We can claim they were recovered through our ongoing efforts to locate missing artifacts. The people get their treasures back, and the monarchy remains stable. The people get their treasures back through more lies, you mean? Isabella moved away from his desk, needing physical distance as she processed what felt like a fundamental betrayal. Alexander, I took an oath when I became queen. An oath to serve this kingdom with honor and integrity. How can I continue to do that while participating in a massive deception? Alexander stood again, moving toward her with his hands extended in a gesture that might have been pleading. Isabella, I'm asking you to consider the broader implications. Yes, my mother made questionable decisions. Yes, the secrecy around these items has been problematic. But revealing this information now would destroy everything we've worked to build during our reign. Everything we've worked to build has been built on a lie. Isabella's voice was quiet but firm. Alexander, I found documents in that chamber that show your mother removed items worth millions from the royal treasury. Items that were supposed to be available for public viewing. Items that were supposed to be part of our diplomatic gift exchanges with other nations. She created false reports about their disappearance and allowed investigations to proceed that wasted government resources searching for items she knew were hidden in the palace. You're talking about my mother as if she were a common criminal. I'm talking about her as if she committed crimes, which she did. Isabella's interruption was sharp. Alexander, the crown of queens that we told the ambassador from Meridian was lost in the uprising? It's sitting in that chamber. We accepted their condolences and their offers to help locate it, knowing all along that it was hidden behind a portrait in our own palace. Alexander's face had gone pale, but his voice remained steady. Isabella, what exactly are you suggesting we do? Hold a press conference and announce that my deceased mother was a thief? Watch as Parliament votes to dissolve the monarchy and establish a republic? Destroy centuries of tradition and heritage because of decisions made during a turbulent period that's now long past. Isabella walked to the window again, looking out at the gardens where palace staff were going about their evening duties, unaware that their queen and king were having a conversation that might determine the future of their monarchy. I'm suggesting we tell the truth. I'm suggesting we reveal what happened, return the items to their proper places, and work to rebuild trust with our people through honesty rather than continued deception. And I'm suggesting that such a course of action would be political suicide, both for us personally and for the institution of the monarchy. Alexander's voice had taken on the formal tone he used during state functions, creating even more distance between them. Isabella, I understand your moral concerns, but, as monarchs, we have responsibilities that sometimes conflict with simple moral preferences. Isabella turned back to face him, and, for the first time in their marriage, she felt like she was looking at a stranger. Moral preferences? Alexander, we're talking about theft, fraud, and decades of lying to our people. These aren't moral preferences. They're fundamental questions about whether we deserve the trust our people place in us. We deserve that trust because we've provided stable, effective leadership for this kingdom. Because we've maintained diplomatic relationships, supported economic growth, and preserved cultural heritage. The people care about results, Isabella, not about the specific details of how certain challenges were managed by previous administrations. Isabella shook her head slowly. I can't believe what I'm hearing. You're talking about covering up crimes committed by your mother, as if they were minor administrative decisions. Alexander moved back to his desk, shuffling through papers with more force than necessary. I'm talking about protecting the monarchy from unnecessary damage caused by revelations about events that happened decades ago and can't be changed. They can't be changed, but their effects can be addressed. Alexander, some of the items in that chamber are supposed to be on display in our National Museum. Scholars have been writing papers about their loss. Historians have been trying to reconstruct their significance from photographs and secondary sources. We have the power to correct those injustices. We also have the power to destroy our own reign and everything we've accomplished. Alexander looked up from his papers, his eyes showing a hardness that Isabella had never seen before. Isabella, I need to know right now whether you're going to support the crown or whether you're going to pursue a course of action that could destroy everything our families have built over centuries. The ultimatum hung between them like a sword. Isabella realized that this conversation had moved far beyond discussion of Queen Victoria's crimes and had become a fundamental test of her marriage, her role as queen, and her personal integrity. I need time to think about this, Alexander. I need time to understand how the man I married, the man I've ruled beside for 12 years, can ask me to participate in covering up crimes against our own people. The man you married is someone who understands that ruling sometimes requires making difficult choices that can't be judged by simple standards of right and wrong. Isabella moved toward the door, feeling emotionally exhausted by the conversation. The woman you married is someone who believes that leadership requires honesty, even when honesty is difficult or costly. As she reached for the door handle, Alexander's voice stopped her. Isabella, if you choose to reveal this information, you'll be doing more than exposing my mother's actions. You'll be destroying our marriage and our reign, and quite possibly ending the monarchy itself. I hope you consider whether your moral certainty is worth those consequences. Isabella left the study without responding, but Alexander's words echoed in her mind as she walked through corridors that suddenly felt foreign and hostile. The palace that had been her home for 12 years now felt like an elaborate prison built from secrets and lies. As she made her way back to her private apartments, Isabella realized that her discovery in the hidden chamber had done more than reveal Queen Victoria's crimes. It had exposed fundamental differences between herself and Alexander that might be impossible to reconcile. The question now wasn't just whether to reveal the truth about the stolen treasures, but whether she could continue to serve as queen while maintaining her integrity, and whether her marriage could survive the weight of such different approaches to honor and responsibility. Isabella spent a sleepless night in her private sitting room, surrounded by documents she had carefully retrieved from Queen Victoria's hidden chamber. By candlelight, she read through decades of meticulous records that painted an increasingly disturbing picture of systematic deception and theft. The more she learned, the more she realized that Alexander's characterization of his mother's actions as protective measures was either naive or deliberately misleading. The documents revealed that Queen Victoria had not simply hidden valuable items during times of political unrest. She had carefully orchestrated elaborate deceptions, creating false reports of theft and loss that had triggered government investigations, diplomatic incidents, and even military responses. When the crown of queens had supposedly been stolen during the 1987 uprising, Victoria's false reports had led to the arrest and imprisonment of 12 innocent citizens who were accused of being part of the theft conspiracy. Isabella's hands trembled as she read Victoria's own words describing the satisfactory conclusion of the investigation, noting with apparent satisfaction that the arrested individuals had been sentenced to substantial prison terms. The casual cruelty of allowing innocent people to suffer for crimes that were never committed made Isabella physically ill. As dawn broke over the palace gardens, Isabella made a decision that she knew would change everything. She could not, in good conscience, allow the lies to continue. But she also could not ignore Alexander's warnings about the potential consequences of revelation. What she needed was advice from someone who understood both the moral dimensions of leadership and the practical realities of political survival. Isabella's first stop was the chapel, where she had often found solace during difficult times throughout her reign. Father Benedict, the royal chaplain, was preparing for morning prayers when she arrived. He was a man in his 70s who had served 3 generations of the royal family and had earned a reputation for wise counsel and unwavering integrity. "Your Majesty, you look troubled. May I offer assistance with whatever weighs upon your heart?" Isabella knelt beside him at the altar, grateful for the peace of the sacred space. "Father, I need guidance about a moral dilemma that has implications far beyond my personal conscience. I've discovered that Queen Victoria committed serious crimes against the people of this kingdom, and King Alexander wants me to help cover them up to protect the monarchy." Father Benedict's weathered hands stilled on his prayer book. "That is indeed a heavy burden, Your Majesty. May I ask about the nature of these crimes?" Isabella explained her discovery of the hidden chamber and the evidence of Victoria's systematic theft and deception. She shared the documentation of innocent people imprisoned for crimes they didn't commit and the ongoing lies that had damaged relationships with allied nations. "Father, Alexander argues that revealing this information would destroy the monarchy and cause chaos throughout the kingdom. He says that as queen, my first responsibility is to protect the institution, even if that means participating in continued deception." Father Benedict was quiet for several long minutes, his eyes focused on the altar cross that had witnessed countless royal ceremonies over the centuries. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of deep consideration. "Your Majesty, I have served this royal family for most of my adult life. I baptized King Alexander, officiated at your wedding, and blessed your reign when you took the throne. But my first loyalty has always been to truth and justice, not to any earthly crown." He turned to face Isabella directly. "The scriptures teach us that leadership is a sacred trust. When that trust is built upon lies and deception, it becomes a burden rather than a blessing. Your Majesty, no institution, not even a monarchy blessed by centuries of tradition, can be preserved through the systematic perpetuation of injustice." Isabella felt tears threatening as the priest's words confirmed what her heart had been telling her all night. "But, Father, what about my duty to the crown? What about my marriage to Alexander? What about the stability of the kingdom?" Your duty to the crown must be balanced against your duty to truth and justice. Your marriage to Alexander cannot flourish when built upon fundamental moral disagreement. And the stability of the kingdom cannot be preserved long-term through continued deception and injustice. Father Benedict placed a gentle hand on Isabella's shoulder. Your Majesty, I believe that true leadership sometimes requires accepting short-term costs to prevent long-term catastrophe. If these lies continue, they will eventually be discovered. When that happens, the damage to the monarchy will be far greater than it would be if you revealed the truth voluntarily and worked to make amends. After leaving the chapel, Isabella made her second stop at the palace library, where she sought out Sir William Hartwell, the royal historian and constitutional expert. William had been her mentor during her early years as queen, teaching her about the legal and historical foundations of Avaloria's monarchy. She found him in his usual spot among the ancient legal texts, researching precedents for a constitutional question that had been raised in Parliament. When Isabella explained her discovery and her dilemma, William's scholarly composure gave way to obvious shock and concern. Your Majesty, if what you're describing is accurate, Queen Victoria violated her coronation oath in the most fundamental way possible. The oath specifically requires the monarch to protect and preserve the kingdom's treasures for future generations, not to steal and hide them for personal or political purposes. William pulled several thick volumes from the shelves, showing Isabella historical precedents for how previous royal scandals had been handled. History shows us that monarchies survive through adaptation and accountability, not through the perpetuation of lies. The British monarchy survived the abdication crisis, the Spanish monarchy survived various scandals, and even our own kingdom survived the constitutional crisis of 1923. He opened to a particular page that detailed how King Edmund III had voluntarily revealed corruption within his own administration in 1923, leading to reforms that actually strengthened the monarchy's relationship with Parliament and the people. Your Majesty, King Edmund's decision to reveal uncomfortable truths about royal administration was initially controversial, but it ultimately led to greater respect for the crown because it demonstrated commitment to justice over self-preservation. William leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. I understand King Alexander's concerns about political ramifications, but I believe his approach is based on a fundamental misunderstanding of what preserves institutional legitimacy. Institutions survive through earned trust, not through hidden deception. Isabella spent the rest of the morning walking through the palace gardens, trying to reconcile the advice she had received with the practical realities of her situation. The weight of decision felt crushing, but the moral clarity was becoming increasingly apparent. As she passed the rose garden that Queen Victoria had established during her reign, Isabella realized that even this beautiful space had been built through lies. The records she had read indicated that Victoria had used funds designated for social programs to finance her elaborate landscaping projects. Isabella's contemplation was interrupted by Lady Margaret, who approached with obvious urgency. Your Majesty, I apologize for the intrusion, but Prime Minister Harrison has requested an immediate audience. He says it concerns urgent matters of national security. Isabella's heart sank. Had someone else discovered the hidden chamber? Had word of her investigation somehow reached the government? She followed Margaret back to the palace, dreading what new complications might be waiting for her. Prime Minister Harrison was waiting in the formal receiving room, his usually calm demeanor replaced by barely contained agitation. He was a man Isabella respected greatly, honest, capable, and genuinely committed to serving the people of Avaloria. Your Majesty, I must speak with you about a matter of extreme sensitivity. We've received information from our intelligence services that suggests there may have been significant irregularities in the royal treasury during Queen Victoria's reign. Isabella felt as if the floor had dropped out from under her. What sort of irregularities, Prime Minister? Our investigators have been conducting a routine audit of government assets as part of our ongoing transparency initiatives. During this process, they discovered discrepancies between historical records of the royal collection and current inventories. Items that were reported as lost or stolen appear to have inconsistent documentation. Harrison pulled out a folder containing official reports and photographs. Your Majesty, I must ask directly. Do you have any knowledge of missing items from the royal collection that might still be in palace custody? Isabella realized that she was facing the moment she had dreaded, the moment when continued deception would require her to lie directly to the Prime Minister and Parliament. She looked into Harrison's honest face and knew that she could not perpetuate Victoria's lies any further. Prime Minister, I discovered something yesterday that I believe addresses your concerns. There are items in palace custody that were incorrectly reported as lost or stolen during Queen Victoria's reign. Harrison's expression shifted from concern to alarm. Your Majesty, are you saying that these items were deliberately misrepresented as missing? I'm saying that Queen Victoria maintained a secret collection of items that should have remained in the official royal treasury. I have documentation that shows she systematically removed valuable artifacts and historical documents while reporting them as lost or stolen. The silence that followed was deafening. Harrison sat back in his chair, clearly struggling to process the implications of what Isabella had just revealed. Your Majesty, this is an extremely serious matter. If Queen Victoria deliberately misrepresented the status of royal treasures, it constitutes fraud against the government and the people of Avaloria. There would need to be a full investigation, and the findings would have to be reported to Parliament. Isabella nodded, feeling simultaneously relieved and terrified. I understand, Prime Minister. I'm prepared to cooperate fully with any investigation and to provide all the documentation I've discovered. Your Majesty, I must ask, does King Alexander have knowledge of these irregularities? Isabella hesitated for just a moment before answering. You would need to discuss that with King Alexander directly, Prime Minister. Harrison closed his folder and stood, his expression grave. Your Majesty, I appreciate your honesty in this matter. However, I must inform you that this revelation will trigger a formal parliamentary investigation. The implications for the monarchy could be severe. As Isabella watched Prime Minister Harrison leave, she realized that her decision to reveal the truth had been made for her. The government investigation would proceed regardless of what Alexander wanted, and the lies that had been maintained for decades were about to be exposed whether the royal family participated willingly or not. Now she faced the task of informing Alexander that his worst fears were about to be realized, not because of her choices, but because the truth had a way of revealing itself regardless of human attempts at concealment. The hidden chamber that had remained secret for nearly 40 years was about to become the center of a national scandal that would test whether the monarchy of Avaloria could survive the revelation of its darkest secrets. Isabella found Alexander in the palace's war room, surrounded by his closest advisors and legal counsel. Word of the government investigation had spread quickly through the palace, and the king's emergency response team was already working to develop damage control strategies. The atmosphere was tense, filled with whispered conversations and the rustle of urgent paperwork. Isabella, Alexander's voice was cold as she entered the room. I trust you understand the magnitude of what you've done. The advisors and lawyers fell silent, clearly uncomfortable with witnessing what appeared to be a royal marital dispute with national implications. Isabella straightened her shoulders and looked directly at her husband. I understand that I've chosen truth over convenient lies, yes. Lord Chancellor Kenneth Blackwood, Alexander's chief legal advisor, stepped forward with a thick folder of documents. Your Majesty, we need to discuss the legal implications of these revelations. The government investigation will likely focus on whether the royal family has committed fraud, theft, and conspiracy to defraud the government. Isabella took the folder and began reading through the preliminary legal analysis her husband's team had prepared. The documents outlined potential criminal charges, civil penalties, and constitutional consequences that could result from the investigation. The scope was staggering. Potential prosecution of current royal family members for conspiracy to conceal historical crimes, massive financial penalties for the value of missing items, and possible parliamentary action to dissolve or significantly restrict the monarchy. These are worst-case scenarios, Alexander said, watching Isabella's face as she read. But they become much more likely if we don't present a united front. Isabella, if you continue to cooperate with the investigation instead of working with our legal team to minimize damage, you could be ensuring our complete destruction. Sir Edmund Vance, the royal family's personal attorney for over 20 years, spread additional documents across the conference table. Your Majesty, there are precedents for managing this type of crisis. We can argue that Queen Victoria's actions were taken during times of political instability and were intended to protect royal assets from potential revolutionary seizure. We can characterize her record-keeping as incomplete rather than deliberately deceptive. Isabella looked up from the legal documents, her expression incredulous. Sir Edmund, Queen Victoria's own writings describe her actions as deliberate deception. She documented her satisfaction with innocent people being imprisoned for crimes she knew they hadn't committed. How can we possibly characterize that as protective intent? Your Majesty, what Queen Victoria wrote in private documents is less important than how her actions can be legally interpreted in the current political context. Isabella set the papers down and walked to the window overlooking the palace courtyard, where she could see government vehicles arriving, presumably investigators and auditors who would begin the formal examination of the royal collection and treasury records. You're asking me to participate in a legal defense based on lies about lies. You want me to help rewrite history to make Queen Victoria's crimes appear justified or at least understandable. Alexander joined her at the window, speaking quietly enough that his advisors couldn't hear. Isabella, I'm asking you to help save our reign and our marriage. We can weather this crisis if we work together, but not if you insist on absolute moral purity at the expense of practical survival. Isabella turned to face him, and, for a moment, she saw the man she had fallen in love with, vulnerable, frightened, and asking for her help. But then, she remembered the documents in Victoria's chamber, the evidence of innocent people suffering for crimes they hadn't committed, and the years of lies that had corrupted every interaction between the royal family and their people. Alexander, I understand you're afraid. I'm afraid too. But I can't build our survival on continued lies. I won't participate in a legal defense that requires me to misrepresent evidence I've personally examined. Before Alexander could respond, Lady Margaret entered the room with obvious urgency. Your Majesty, Prime Minister Harrison has returned with a formal request for immediate access to all royal collection records and storage areas. He's accompanied by auditors, investigators, and parliamentary representatives. Alexander's face went pale. How many investigators? 12, Your Majesty, plus support staff. They have complete search authority under the Parliamentary Investigation Act. Isabella realized that the hidden chamber would be discovered within hours, regardless of whether she revealed its location. The investigators would examine every inch of the palace, and the secret room behind Queen Victoria's portrait would be found. Alexander, they're going to find the chamber whether we tell them about it or not. Our only choice now is whether to reveal it ourselves and demonstrate cooperation, or let them discover it and appear to be hiding evidence. Alexander's advisors began speaking urgently among themselves, calculating political implications and discussing legal strategies. But Alexander himself remained silent, staring out at the investigators who were already unloading equipment from their vehicles. Your Majesty, Sir Edmund said, approaching with a new set of documents. If the investigators discover additional evidence of concealment or obstruction, the legal consequences become exponentially more severe. We strongly recommend full disclosure of any information you possess about Queen Victoria's activities. Isabella watched her husband's face as he processed this advice from his own legal team. She could see him struggling with the realization that his strategy of concealment and damage control was no longer viable. Alexander, Isabella said quietly, we still have time to do the right thing. We can reveal the chamber ourselves, cooperate fully with the investigation, and work to make amends for the damage that was done. It won't be easy, but it's the only path that leads to genuine resolution. Alexander was quiet for several long minutes while his advisors continued their urgent planning around him. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Isabella, if we reveal everything voluntarily, we'll be destroying the image of my mother that the people have cherished for decades. She was beloved, respected, considered a model of royal virtue. Revealing her crimes will devastate people who saw her as a symbol of everything good about the monarchy. Isabella reached for his hand, and, for the first time since her discovery, he didn't pull away. Alexander, maintaining that false image requires us to continue lying to people who trusted us. The people deserve to know the truth about their history, even if that truth is painful. And what about the 12 people who were imprisoned for crimes they didn't commit? What do we tell their families? How do we explain that they suffered for decades while we knew they were innocent? Isabella felt tears beginning to form as the full human cost of Victoria's actions became clear. We apologize. We acknowledge the injustice. We do everything in our power to make amends, even though we can never truly repair the damage that was done. Sir Edmund approached them with a formal document. Your Majesties, the investigators are requesting immediate access to the Royal Gallery and all associated storage areas. We need to make a decision about disclosure within the next few minutes. Alexander looked at the document, then at Isabella, then at the investigators visible through the window. Isabella could see him weighing everything. his love for his mother's memory, his fear for their reign, his concern for the monarchy's survival, and perhaps, finally, his understanding that continued deception was no longer possible. Sir Edmund, Alexander said finally, prepare a statement acknowledging the existence of additional royal collection items that require investigation. We'll provide full access to all palace areas and complete cooperation with the parliamentary investigation. The relief Isabella felt was overwhelming, but it was immediately tempered by the recognition of what lay ahead. The next few days would bring revelations that would shock the kingdom and challenge everything people believed about their royal family. As the advisors began implementing their new strategy of full disclosure and cooperation, Isabella realized that her marriage to Alexander had been fundamentally changed by this crisis. They had discovered that they approached fundamental questions of leadership, integrity, and responsibility in very different ways. Whether their marriage could survive such basic philosophical differences remained to be seen. But, for now, they were committed to facing the consequences of Queen Victoria's actions together. The hidden chamber would be revealed, the stolen treasures would be returned, and the people of Avaloria would learn that their beloved former queen had committed crimes that had been concealed for nearly 40 years. The investigation that followed would test not only the monarchy's survival, but also its ability to rebuild trust through honesty, accountability, and genuine commitment to justice. Isabella had chosen truth over convenience, and now she would discover whether that choice would ultimately strengthen or destroy everything she had spent 12 years working to build. As government investigators entered the palace, beginning the process that would expose decades of royal lies, Isabella stood beside Alexander at the window and prepared to face the most challenging period of their reign. The crown of Avaloria was about to be tested not by external enemies, but by the weight of its own hidden sins and the question of whether redemption was possible for institutions built upon deception. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the courtyard as the investigation began, and Isabella knew that by sunset, the kingdom would never be the same again. 6 months after the revelation of Queen Victoria's hidden chamber, the kingdom of Avaloria found itself in the midst of the most significant constitutional crisis in its modern history. The parliamentary investigation had uncovered evidence even more damaging than Isabella had initially discovered, revealing a network of corruption and deception that had affected not only the royal collection but also land holdings, diplomatic gifts, and charitable funds that were supposed to benefit the people. Isabella stood in the same royal gallery where her discovery had begun, but the space looked completely different now. Queen Victoria's portrait had been removed and placed in storage pending a decision about how, or whether, to display it in the future. The hidden chamber had been converted into a transparent display room where recovered artifacts were exhibited with detailed explanations of how they had been stolen and concealed. The constitutional hearings were scheduled to conclude the following week, and Parliament would then vote on whether to maintain the monarchy, establish a republic, or create some hybrid system that would preserve certain royal traditions while transferring actual governing power to elected officials. Alexander entered the gallery, carrying documents that Isabella recognized as the latest polls showing public support for the monarchy at historically low levels. Their marriage had survived the crisis, but it had been fundamentally changed. They now approached their roles with a hard-earned understanding of how different their natural instincts were regarding leadership and moral responsibility. The latest numbers? Isabella asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. 32% support for maintaining the monarchy as it currently exists, 28% for a constitutional republic, and 40% for some form of modified monarchy with significantly reduced royal authority. Alexander set the documents on a marble bench that had once held stolen artifacts. Better than last month, but still not encouraging. Isabella walked to the window that looked out over the palace gardens, where she could see protesters on both sides of the monarchy debate holding signs and banners. The revelation of Victoria's crimes had triggered a national conversation about the role of royalty in modern democracy, and the people of Avaloria were deeply divided about their conclusions. Sir William thinks the modified monarchy option might be our best outcome, Alexander continued. We would retain ceremonial roles and continue to represent Avaloria diplomatically, but actual governing power would transfer completely to Parliament and the Prime Minister. Isabella considered this possibility. It would mean the end of royal authority as their family had known it for centuries, but it might also provide a path toward rebuilding trust with their people. What would that mean for the palace, for the royal collection, for the traditions that people value? Most of it would be preserved, but administered by the government rather than the royal family. We would become, essentially, highly visible public servants with symbolic rather than actual power. Isabella turned back toward the empty space where Victoria's portrait had hung. Alexander, I've been thinking about something Father Benedict said during the hearings. He testified that institutions survive by adapting to serve justice rather than by preserving power for its own sake. Alexander nodded slowly. The parliamentary hearings had been brutal for both of them, requiring detailed testimony about what they had known, when they had learned it, and how they had responded to the discovery of Victoria's crimes. But the process had also forced them to articulate their vision for the future of Avaloria's monarchy. Isabella, I owe you an apology, not just for my initial response to your discovery, but for spending years complicit in maintaining lies I knew were wrong. You were right to insist on truth, even when I couldn't see past the immediate political costs. Isabella reached for his hand, grateful that their relationship had found its way to honesty even in the midst of professional and personal crisis. We both made mistakes, Alexander. But we also learned something important about ourselves and about what kind of leaders we want to be. Lady Margaret approached them with the latest correspondence from other constitutional monarchies around the world. Several had offered advice and support as Avaloria navigated its constitutional crisis, sharing their own experiences with reforming royal institutions to better serve democratic values. Your Majesties, there's also this letter from the families of the 12 individuals who were wrongfully imprisoned during Queen Victoria's reign. Margaret's voice was gentle as she handed over an envelope bearing multiple signatures. Isabella opened the letter carefully, knowing that whatever it contained would be emotionally difficult to read. The letter was addressed to both monarchs, and began with a formal acknowledgement of their efforts to reveal the truth and make amends for past injustices. But what followed was more generous than Isabella had expected. The families acknowledged the pain caused by Queen Victoria's actions and the decades of concealment that followed, but they also expressed appreciation for Isabella and Alexander's decision to reveal the truth rather than continue the deception. Several family members wrote that learning the truth, however painful, was preferable to living with the false belief that their loved ones had committed crimes against the kingdom they had faithfully served. The letter concluded with a proposal that surprised both monarchs. The family suggested that the most meaningful form of restitution would be the establishment of a Truth and Justice Foundation, administered jointly by the royal family and Parliament, dedicated to preventing similar injustices in the future and supporting victims of government wrongdoing. They're offering us a path toward redemption, Isabella said, sharing the letter with Alexander. Not just forgiveness, but partnership in building something better. Alexander read the letter carefully, his expression shifting from surprise to something that might have been hope. Isabella, this could be the framework for a new kind of monarchy. Not one based on traditional authority, but one dedicated to service and accountability. Over the following week, as the constitutional hearings concluded and Parliament prepared for its historic vote, Isabella and Alexander worked with advisors to develop a proposal that would address the concerns raised during the investigation while preserving elements of royal tradition that still served valuable purposes. Their proposal, which they presented to Parliament and the people through a series of public addresses, outlined a radically reformed monarchy that would maintain ceremonial and cultural functions while transferring all governing authority to elected officials. The royal family would commit to unprecedented transparency, submitting to regular audits and oversight that would prevent future abuses of trust. Most significantly, they proposed that the monarchy's primary mission should shift from ruling to serving, specifically to administering programs dedicated to justice, education, and cultural preservation. The Truth and Justice Foundation suggested by the wrongfully imprisoned families would become the monarchy's central initiative, symbolizing its commitment to accountability and redemption. On the day of Parliament's vote, Isabella and Alexander waited in their private apartments while the nation decided their fate. They had done everything they could to demonstrate their commitment to reform and accountability. Now the choice belonged to the people's representatives. The vote was closer than anyone had predicted. 298 votes for the reformed monarchy proposal, 285 votes for establishing a republic, and 117 votes for maintaining the traditional monarchy. The Kingdom of Avaloria would keep its royal family, but in a form that bore little resemblance to the institution Queen Victoria had presided over. As Isabella and Alexander prepared for their new roles as constitutional monarchs with primarily symbolic authority. They reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. Isabella's discovery in the hidden chamber had ultimately led to the most significant democratic reforms in Avaloria's history, transforming both the monarchy and the broader government in ways that strengthened accountability and transparency. The royal collection was now administered by a joint parliamentary commission, with all items on permanent public display and detailed historical documentation available to scholars and citizens alike. The palace itself had been partially converted into a museum and educational center, preserving royal traditions while making them accessible to all citizens rather than exclusive to the royal family. Isabella's final act as queen with governing authority was to formally pardon the 12 individuals who had been wrongfully imprisoned for Queen Victoria's crimes, expunging their records and establishing compensation funds for their families. The ceremony took place in the same gallery where she had discovered Victoria's hidden chamber, symbolizing the transformation of a space associated with royal lies into one dedicated to royal accountability. As she and Alexander emerged from the constitutional crisis, Isabella realized that her marriage had not only survived but had been strengthened by their shared experience of choosing principle over convenience. They had learned that their different approaches to leadership, his pragmatic caution and her moral directness, could complement each other when both were directed towards serving justice rather than preserving power. The reformed monarchy of Avaloria became a model for other constitutional monarchies around the world, demonstrating that institutions built on tradition could adapt and evolve to better serve democratic values without losing their cultural significance. Isabella and Alexander's decision to choose truth over convenience had initially threatened to destroy their reign, but ultimately it had created something far more valuable, a form of leadership based on earned trust rather than inherited authority. Years later, as Isabella looked back on the crisis that had defined their reign, she realized that Queen Victoria's hidden chamber had contained more than stolen treasures. It had contained the seeds of transformation that allowed the monarchy to evolve from an institution that demanded loyalty into one that earned respect through service, accountability, and unwavering commitment to truth. The crown of Avaloria no longer carried the weight of absolute authority, but it had gained something far more precious, the genuine trust and partnership of the people it served. In choosing to reveal uncomfortable truths rather than maintain comfortable lies, Isabella and Alexander had discovered that real power comes not from the ability to command, but from the courage to lead by example toward a more just and honest future.